You probably don't understand Latin American culture as well as you think you do. At least, not in its totality. But before we dive into this topic, my only disclaimer is going to be that if you want to keep a pristine image of Latin Americans and Latin American culture, then this video is not for you. Now to begin with, let's briefly talk about the part of Latin American culture that everyone, or mostly everyone, knows about, which is the fact that Latin Americans are kind, they're friendly, very family-oriented, and for the most part, quite peaceful. And something that I noticed as someone who was raised in the United States and who is currently living in a Latin American country, which is Ecuador, is that Latin Americans who are living in the United States also have these characteristics as long as they're still somehow connected to their roots. And all of this is great, of course, but now we have to talk about the side of the culture that you probably don't know about. Probably the easiest way to summarize this part of the culture is with two words: Viveza, criolla. But what is that? The translation for the word viveza is liveliness, while the translation for the word criollo is Creole. But neither of these two words really express what viveza criolla is. On the other hand, the definition of these words does shed a little bit more light on what viveza criolla is, since in the case of viveza, it does say that it is the agility in execution, and it does also talk about being ingenious. While on the other hand, when we look for criollo, it says that it is a native or inhabitant of Latin America of European descent. It also gives another definition, which is commonly heard, of any of various South American breeds of domestic animal. So at this point, you will probably think that Viveza criolla isn't a big deal, since if you fuse the definitions of these two words together, you would probably get something like an ingenious person who is of Latin American descent. But that's not really the full extent of what Viveza criolla is. It's just its best possible interpretation. Viveza criolla doesn't actually have an official definition, or at least I'm not able to find one, and no one's willing to give me one. So I, after spending so much time here in Ecuador, in Latin America itself, have made my own definition for this term, which is basically the act of doing something that Latin American society will deem as really smart, but is actually in fact either really dumb, irresponsible, disrespectful, or just downright mean. Now, before I give some examples of what Viveza criolla is, I'm pretty sure that there's going to be someone out there who's going to say,
"This isn't true. This can't be true."
And to you, well, first of all, remember, I am Ecuadorian, and if you don't believe me because I lived a considerable amount of time in the States, then you can ask my friends who are actual Ecuadorians and my acquaintances who are also Ecuadorians who complain about Viveza criolla all the time. And now I'm pretty sure that there's going to be someone who, after hearing that, thinks that,
Well, okay, so this is just an Ecuador problem.
and I actually thought that that was the case, until I found a Facebook post where someone was complaining about a certain situation, and the comment from a person on that post was, "I have experienced this type of behavior in some Latin American countries. It's so unfortunate. I like to call it Viveza criolla, where people just seize any opportunity to take advantage of others. They notice a foreign accent and the price is suddenly higher. They lack responsibility of any kind and blame others for their mistakes. They are selfish and only think of themselves first and then the consequences. Maybe. They go cunning people left and right." When I first read this comment, what surprised me the most about it was the fact that someone actually mentioned Viveza criolla, because no one talks about it, and that's probably because no one knows about it, which is why I want to give you some examples of what Viveza criolla looks like so that you know what you should look out for when you're here in Ecuador or apparently in any Latin American country. Probably the most common form of Viveza criolla that a foreigner will run into in any Latin American country is the situation with the price hike. And this one might actually be the most unavoidable one unless you know the language, you happen to look like a native, or you are really good at haggling. But haggling doesn't go very well unless you happen to know the language. So this one can be quite unavoidable since you don't know the prices, the official prices for the products that the people are selling you. Another really common form of Viveza criolla that you're going to see constantly out on the streets is a complete lack of the rules of transit or rules of any kind, as long as there are no police around. But the worst part about this isn't the lack of respect for authority, since you should know to follow the rules even when there isn't an authority figure around. It's actually more the fact of how dangerous it can get, since it isn't limited to just jaywalking, which is dangerous enough as it is, but it also goes on into people going past red lights, going past stop signs, and people speeding at speeds that just make no sense on a normal road in the city. And while I do think this particular form of Viveza criolla is more prevalent here in the coast, since I do see it on a day-to-day basis, especially when people speed past red lights, and even more commonly when people drive their motorcycles on sidewalks in order to get ahead of the whole traffic congestion that you see, and then they commit another infraction by going past a red light. You see that a lot here in the coast, so don't be surprised when you come to the coast and experience that. But in the highlands, it is something that happens as well. There is this situation with people not respecting transit law or the police in general if there is no police around. So it is something that you'll find all around Ecuador. Another form of Viveza criolla has to do with responsibility, or a lack of responsibility, or actually a lack of being able to take responsibility for your actions. And on a smaller scale, there is the really well-known problem with what is called the Ecuadorian hour, which is basically when people arrive late to things. And this one is so common that there's just no going around it. Just always expect people to never be on time for anything here, and to always blame anything but themselves for being late to an event. Literally, the running joke is that a person will tell you, "I'm 5 minutes away," when they haven't even gotten up to shower. Yes, it is that bad. On a more extreme scale, people will be willing to throw you under the bus if it means them not getting in trouble for something that they very much did themselves. The worst scenario that I've seen happen when it comes to this is when someone commits a transit accident, and instead of making sure that if they crashed into the other car, the other person is okay, they just take off. This most likely happens because no one has insurance here, and paying for an accident like hitting a car or even a motorcycle can be quite expensive. And I'm not justifying it, I just do understand why it happens, and the root of the problem is responsibility itself, since people should be responsible enough to get some kind of insurance to protect them from a car accident, and since they don't have it and they have to pay expensive values for that car accident, they just find it easier to run, since most of the time they probably won't be chased down or caught anyways. The next form of Viveza criolla is probably one that you won't really take too much into consideration unless you live in Ecuador or are an Ecuadorian, since it affects mainly people who are Ecuadorians and are living here. And it's basically synonymous to corruption, since it has to do with how you obtain work or how you get things done in Ecuador. And I don't know what kind of word to give it other than corruption, but as most people who might have watched videos on my channel might already know, when you get work here, typically you don't get a work based on merit, you get it if you have a good connection. And I don't mean internet connection, I mean if you know someone who happens to be in a position of power at the place that you're trying to apply for work. And it's not only something that's related to work, it's also something that if you want to get a process done, like you want to go file a document or you want to go do some kind of thing at the IRS or maybe a different kind of government institution, if you know someone, or even better, if you can pay someone, because even when you know the people, you have to pay. If you know someone and you can pay, then there's a high chance that your process will be much faster. And in the case of work, like I mentioned earlier, you're probably more than likely to get the job. And the last thing I want to mention about Viveza Criolla is the fact that no one is going to tell you about Viveza Criolla. Think about it like this. Have you ever heard of Viveza Criolla from a native Ecuadorian or otherwise from a source that's not me? You probably haven't. And the reason being, I think, should be very obvious, because Viveza Criolla, the idea that people can be this way, is a very negative thing. And as anyone who runs a business or has any understanding of economy might understand, it's the fact that you don't ever promote the negative things about your business, or about, in this case, about your country, if you want people to visit your country or people to buy something from your business. And once again, it goes back into the whole taking accountability for things. People don't want to be held accountable for the things that they do. They're very happy with promoting a great product, a great service, and in this case, a great country, but they won't tell you the reality that is also behind that great product or service. And I feel like if your country, in this case, I feel that Ecuador is such a great country that even with the problems, people will still be willing to visit. I see it all the time. There are people who are very aware of the problems that are happening in the country, but they still want to live here, they still want to move here, they still want to visit here. And that's great. And I think it's better to be honest about these things so that the person knows what is in store for them when they come to the country. And it's very unfair when they don't know and when they listen to a source that has only told them the good things, and then they come to the country and realize it's not what they expected. The topic of Viveza Criolla is a really frustrating and sad one, especially taking into consideration all the positive aspects that define Latin American culture. Having Viveza Criolla in the middle of all of this just completely destroys the idea of what Latin American culture is. And it completely blindsides you, especially since it's not something that's frequently talked about when you visit the country and run into it. And as someone who lives here and has to come face to face with this problem on a daily basis, I can tell you that it's not just something that you can play off as that's how people are everywhere in the world, or that's how people who are bad or with malice are in general. It's just something that makes you not be able to trust people. It stifles the possibility of progress, since, like I mentioned earlier, it does relate to corruption. If people are always just hiring because this person is my friend, you never have people who actually deserve the job. And what's worse, those people who actually deserve the job, since they can't even find the job, they end up going and doing something that has nothing to do with what they studied, and they just kind of get left behind in life. And this isn't the case for everyone. There are going to be situations, but the general consensus of what happens here in Ecuador, the general idea of how Viveza Criolla works, it's everywhere, and it's deeply rooted into the culture of the people. And not just in Ecuador, like I mentioned earlier, there are other Latin American countries that suffer through this as well. So hopefully the purpose of this video isn't misconstrued as something like, oh, we're here talking about the negative aspect of Latin American culture so that you hate Latin American culture. Not at all. If you are a Latin American who is learning about this and who has now found out that this is something that actually happens here, it's a good opportunity for you to maybe talk to fellow Latin Americans or teach the future generation of Latin Americans that it doesn't have to be this way. We can still only have the positive characteristics and leave aside the negative ones. Actually do things right so that way things don't keep going for the next generation and they're better for them than it was for us, or that it is for us. And if you're someone who didn't know about it, like I always say with my videos, this is the perfect way for you to be prepared for something that you might not have known about because other people aren't willing to talk about it. I really hope that this helps, and as a final takeaway, I do want to say that no one is perfect. Nowhere in the world is there a perfect person. The closest thing we get is someone who matches our idea of perfection. But it's okay. No one has to be perfect. Because remember, we can always be better.